Welcome to another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show on the Artist First Radio Network. All past broadcasts are podcasts. Find them at artistfirst.com. And now, your host, live from England, here she is. It's Deborah Ruffini.
Greetings from England. This is Deborah Ruffini with another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show. Today it's our privilege to have the lovely Nancy Little here again with us, and being as insightful as ever and informative as to. Today we'll be looking at the memories of traumatic events and how they can show up sort of resurfacing in nightmares, really, which can happen a fair while later. And it's not always easy to, we can't snap out of things, and things can't, unfortunately, be gotten rid of, in a short while. So, Nancy, pleased to be speaking with you. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, thank you.
Oh.
I think, a lot of people are aware of my story by now, but for those who aren't, I was sexually abused by my mother growing up, and with a close friend of hers who happened to be a chiropractor, and there was sexual abuse between the two of them with me. There was also sexual abuse with just Dr. Smiley, which is what her name was. And, one of the things that people don't always quite understand is as you grow up and you move out of your home and you move on into your life, into college, if you go to college, and then either with a partner or you get married, is that even though you have left the childhood home where the abuse happened, there often are what we call PTSD symptoms that affect our lives ongoing from that point on, even though we're not in the abuse itself, and even though it's not happening anymore, the effects of what happened can affect our lives for quite a bit afterwards.
Yeah.
And so, when I moved out of the home when I was a sophomore in college, and I had a boss who recognized that there was some issues with my mother, and she actually helped me financially to get an apartment, and I was able to move out into a very small, what we call here, efficiency apartments. They also could be called studio apartments, but it was basically one small room where you had your living room, kitchen, everything was in one room. But I was safe, and that's what was important. However, just because I wasn't being sexually abused anymore didn't mean that the abuse wasn't still affecting me.
Yeah.
And it showed up in PTSD symptoms, which is short for post-traumatic stress disorder. And you see it a lot in abuse survivors. You see it a lot in military personnel when they come home from the military. And it can show up through memories. It can show up through nightmares. It can show up through flashbacks. And so, even though I was not in the abuse setting per se, there were still things that was greatly affecting my life. And, in the beginning, you're so excited or so glad to just be out of the house that you tend to try to downplay the effects of the PTSD, and you may not even recognize it at first. And for me, it showed up in like small things, like sudden noises.
Okay.
My dad used to hide in the house in the dark. And when I would come in late at night from babysitting, he would be in the hallway and he would just appear in a corner, where there's no light in the house, it's completely dark, and just scare the living daylights out of me. And he just thought it was funny.
Yeah.
Like a real joke. And it was, for me anyway, it was terrifying to, come around in a dark house at 1 o'clock in the morning, not expecting anybody to be awake, and he would jump out, and yell at me, and, well, why are you getting in so late, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, I had a babysitting job. You knew this. And, oh, yeah, okay. But when you're constantly being jumped at in the dark, you start to become where you start to live on edge constantly.
Yeah.
You're constantly afraid of, basically going around that corner and not knowing what's going to be there.
Yes.
With my mother, there were PTSD symptoms, and it was simple things like, hearing a noise at night. I used to lay awake at night, and I would watch her footsteps under the door.
Oh.
And when you're a child and you're constantly afraid of, is this the night that Mom's going to come in my room, you look for the shadow of feet. And I would lay awake and listen for whether her footsteps came closer to the door or whether her footsteps went the opposite direction to her room. And so you become acutely aware as a child to these type of sounds. So even when I moved out and ended up, at 2 years after I moved out, I got married, you become acutely aware to those sounds in your current life.
Yeah.
And that puts you on edge because your mind is still going back to what happened when you're a child. But you're not in that situation anymore. And so it can be acutely frightening.
Yes.
Because you're like, well, I'm not in that situation anymore, so, why am I focusing on this? And it's confusing, it can be embarrassing, or you may not even understand why these sounds are even bothering you. And even today, with all the therapy I've had, I would say that the majority of my PTSD symptoms has dissipated. But there's still a few things, like my husband coming into the room and I'm not aware that, he has come home. Or he's even walking in the room, and if I'm reading a book or engrossed in my laptop and I don't know he's there, literally, I still jump.
Yes.
And we're talking 50 years, 55 years after the fact. But there's just a few things like that still have not completely gone away.
Yeah.
PTSD symptoms can rear its head in nightmares and flashbacks, which we're going to talk about in another interview at some point. But it's important for us as survivors to identify when these symptoms emerge, because, the majority of people don't talk about it. And even in therapy, a lot of survivors are reluctant to even discuss it in therapy because you're afraid of being labeled crazy.
Yeah.
There must be something mentally wrong with you if you're constantly feeling on edge, if you're constantly having a physical reaction. PTSD can be a memory. It can spark even from a smell.
Yeah.
Let's say there's something that was in the room when you were being abused as a child, that smell 30 years later can bring you right back to that moment.
Yes.
Even though it's not happening right now, it's a trigger for that memory in our head. And so it's important to talk about this. It's important to bring up to your therapist, to deal with it in therapy, because just trying to tell yourself, oh, I'm just going to ignore this, it doesn't stop it. It doesn't change things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true, isn't it? It's I think how things can, just as you were saying that then, Nancy, I was thinking about, I was in a shop the other day, and it was just a supermarket, and I had this, it was one of the self-service checkout, and this smell entered my nose, and it was quite a pleasant, it was like a perfume smell, and it made me feel good, and it reminded me of something that I had no conscious memory of what it was, but it was something that I knew if I'd been conscious about it, I could link it back to something good. And I think you're right, there's certain things, either smell or even hearing a song can make us think of something, reminding me of something bad, and it can be of like many years ago.
Absolutely. And, some of the symptoms that can cause, emotional reactions are hard to put into words. And I think that's why for so many people, they're afraid to bring it up to the therapist, or they're afraid to talk to the friend about it, because like being easily started or frightened. And this is something that I had for years, and I always felt like I was on guard for danger, that I was constantly looking around, trying to scope out, is this a safe place for me? Is this a dangerous place for me? And so even as a child, I was very much self-aware of every situation, like acutely aware.
Yeah.
And so I was constantly trying to figure out every situation so I could plan ahead if I was going to be hurt, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And so when you grow up and you move out and you become a young adult, those don't just go away. They don't stop.
Yeah.
And I can tell you from experience, it's exhausting to constantly feel like you have to figure out if I do this, what is going to happen?
Yeah.
And if I'm in this situation, is something else going to happen? So you're constantly not only dealing with the present, but you're also trying to figure out what can happen if I do this, or this. And so your mind it never stops.
Yeah.
It could be partially why for the longest time I never slept, and still struggle with it without having some sleep meds. But I would constantly as a child stay awake, trying to figure out, is this the night that my mom's going to come in my room?
Oh.
And so when you're constantly trying to stay awake because in a child's mind, you think if I know for sure she's going to come in my room and this is going to happen, then I can do this to protect myself.
Yeah.
And so, as a child, I learned to, I slept on my stomach because it made her harder for her to come in and pull down my pajama bottoms and my underwear.
Oh, Nancy, yeah.
And so as a child, you're constantly looking for ways to make it, something bad is going to happen, so you're looking for ways to make that bad better.
Yeah, yeah.
But when you grow up and you move out, that person isn't there to hurt you anymore, but all those feelings of nighttime and not being safe is still there.
Yeah, associations, yeah. Yeah.
And so it can rear its ugly head in sleeping. It can rear its ugly head in having trouble concentrating because your mind is still, it's like your mind is going 1,000 times faster than it should be because you're constantly trying to play out what can happen if I do this, this, and this, and what can I do to stop that from happening?
Yeah.
It's kind of like being on a merry-go-round, going 1,000 miles an hour, and you're trying to figure out how to stop it to get off.
Yeah, that's hard. That's difficult. And I mean, like going into things like, it's not something you can, there's no off switch, is there? You can't sort of, I don't know how, I guess there's no...
You don't know how to stop it, so to speak.
Yeah.
And, again, for the longest time until I, finally opened up to my therapist about it, you carry a great deal of shame surrounding this because it's hard to explain to somebody. How do you explain to somebody that loud noise that you heard in the house, which turned out to be, something, not important, brought you back memory-wise to a certain event where you had been hurt as a child. And trying to find that connection, and even if you do figure out the connection, it still kind of makes you feel kind of crazy in a sense. Because you self-doubt everything. Well, if I had just done this differently, it wouldn't have happened. But, even as we move out and we move on with our lives, our memory is still stuck at the age that the abuse happened.
Yeah.
Even though we're maybe 30 or 40 or 50 years old, the memory of what happened in our head is still at age 5 or 6 or whatever age that it happened. And so our thought process is still thinking about it like we thought about it as a child.
Yes.
And so that's why it is important to, to talk about this with your therapist and to deal with it because, it doesn't just, I'd love to say it just goes away on its own, but it doesn't.
No.
And when you're dealing with those PTSD symptoms, that means the other people around you are also dealing with them, and they're not going to always understand what's going on with you at the time. If you can make that connection and can, talk with that person about it. I mean, my poor husband, the first few years of marriage, didn't know if he was coming or going.
Yeah.
And at the time, I couldn't find a good therapist who knew how to deal with mothers who had sexually abused their children. And we were just kind of basically stumbling along in life together. But he traveled for his job, and I could not understand, and he couldn't understand. I had these just intense reactions to him leaving.
Oh, yes, I bet.
And to me, it felt like he was never going to come back.
Yeah.
Even though he always did come back, but at the time when I had to say goodbye, it was just horrendously painful. And he couldn't understand why the reaction was so intense. And I would get frustrated at myself because I didn't understand it.
Yeah.
But looking back and having gone through the therapy, I now know it was that connection to, as a child, when my mother would leave me with Dr. Smiley and I would be sexually abused there.
My goodness.
And I felt so abandoned and so alone.
Yeah.
And so as an adult, when he would leave, my emotional side was going back to as a child when I felt abandoned and alone and knew I was going to get hurt again. And that's where my emotional side was coming from, even when we first married. But since we had no way of really connecting the two, we just kind of stumbled along the first couple of years of marriage.
Yeah. Thank goodness he was so supportive and understood, and that takes something, doesn't it, to actually think, right, okay, let's go through this together, let's get through this together, let's learn about this. And it's good that you had a supportive chap there.
I mean, I'm blessed and lucky and grateful that I did have a husband who, would constantly reassure me and tell me he wasn't going anywhere and he wasn't going to leave me.
Yeah.
And because, I mean, a lot of marriages do break up in the first few years of marriage with women who have been abused, because these things are constantly on the forefront, and if you don't have a good counselor or somebody to help walk you through what is going on, it's hard to navigate a marriage through all of that.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, he found me many a day just curled up in a ball in the back of the closet. And I didn't understand why, and he didn't understand why. And now I know that was the one safe place that I felt calm.
Yeah, yeah.
That I could calm myself and kind of could shut out all the noise and the feelings that I was feeling on the inside. But then again, reality would set in, and he'd be like, well, why are you in the closet? And I'm like, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
It just, the feelings and the memories and everything just got so intense, and I would end up in the closet.
Yeah, that's understandable.
But luckily I had a husband who didn't give up on me and was willing to work with me, and even when I did start therapy, was willing to go in and talk with the counselor to see how he can help me. But not everybody has spouses who will do that.
No.
And a lot of spouses just get frustrated, like, well, I mean, okay, it happened and it's over, so why can't you just get over it?
Yeah,
just telling somebody to just get over it is so not helpful.
No. And it's very dismissive.
If I could just get over it, don't you think I already would?
Yeah. It's very dismissive, isn't it, to say just get. It's almost like treating someone like they're a robot, to say, oh, come on, snap out of it, just get over it.
Just get over it. Well, don't you think I've already tried that?
Yeah, exactly. And even like the comments, sorry, Nancy, but like some of the comments in the talks that you've given are unbelievable, aren't they? I know we've covered this before, but you think, my goodness, the amount of people that actually aren't humans, the cold comments regarding a horrific things that have happened to a person.
Well, and I think part of that is the lack of understanding how damaging sexual abuse is to children, and people need to understand it's not just the act, the sexual act that is hurtful. Yes, that's hurtful, but it's all the emotional and the psychological abuse that goes along with it.
Yeah.
And, now we are talking more and more, as people are understanding abuse, about how a sexual predator grooms a child. And the same thing happens even at home. If it's a parent or step-parent or a relative, the same type of emotional abuse occurs there, because a abuser has to find a way to get the child compliant.
Yeah.
Because if they don't, the child, they're at the risk of the child telling, and the adult doesn't want that because they know they could end up in jail or prison.
Yes.
And so they have to figure out a way of spinning it to the child that makes it okay. Okay enough so the child doesn't tell. And, that could be anything from promising the child, okay, well, if you let me do this, then I'll buy you that.
Oh.
Or it could be threatening the child. Well, if you tell anybody, they're not going to believe you. They're going to send you away, and you don't want to have to go away to jail, do you? Well, the child doesn't understand, that this is a manipulation.
Yeah.
They just don't want to have to leave their home and the other parent and where they feel halfway safe at. And so they won't say anything just because they're afraid.
Yeah.
But that's still a manipulation. It's still grooming a child. And so it's important for people to understand that it's not just the sexual act that's damaging. It's the psychological abuse surrounding it that is damaging.
Yes. Yeah. It's vast, isn't it? There's sort of, it's like a domino effect. It's, it can get sort of broader and harder.
One thing, this happens, you do another, this happens, and it continues.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of therapy, do you feel that sometimes there can be some therapists that can be, I don't know about sometimes more harm than good, or some that actually aren't so good at how? Sorry, yeah.
I think, honestly, most people need to unpack this with a good therapist.
Yeah.
But if they need to look for someone who has been trained in trauma and abuse.
Yes.
There are a lot of therapists who will say, I've dealt with sexual abuse, but they've had no trauma training.
Mm.
And it's so important when you're looking for a therapist to look for somebody who has been trained in trauma therapy.
Yeah.
Because when you're dealing with sexual abuse, you're dealing with a perpetrator who has manipulated a child emotionally.
Mm.
And to unpack that as an adult, you need to understand that emotional, psychological aspect. And I've talked with numerous survivors over the years. I've run my online chat for survivors for 25, 26 years now. And I've talked with hundreds of survivors online. And a lot of people end up with therapists who really, truly do not understand the psychological side of an abuser.
Oh, that's dangerous.
And they can do more damage, can do more harm than good sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's why when, I've worked with people on finding a therapist, I always encourage them to look for someone who has been trained in trauma therapy.
Mm.
Because they can literally make or break, someone's healing journey.
Yes.
And someone who has dealt with rape or sexual abuse knows how to work with a survivor, knows how to spot PTSD, and can help them in their recovery. But if you have not really been trained in it, you just think, okay, well, we'll just sit and, chat about it, and they do not recognize symptoms of PTSD. They don't recognize, what we talked about with the last interview when we talked about self-harm. And as, we talked about last time, self-harm is very prevalent. And survivors of abuse.
Mm.
And
Yes.
if you're not trained to recognize that, you can do more harm than good in the healing process.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. It's you got to be. It's something that one has to be very careful with, doesn't it? Because it's can't afford to make anything worse for the survivor.
And, when you start therapy, I often tell people, don't be surprised if in the beginning it does feel kind of like things are falling apart. That's pretty normal when you first start therapy, because you're first starting to unpack those memories for the first time.
Yeah.
And so it can feel like in the beginning that therapy is making it worse. And it's not that it's making it worse per se. It's just that you're opening up that can of worms for the first time in your life. Because when you've spent most of your life, like 20 or 30 years in some cases, I spoke to a lady who's 58 after she watched the last video, and she had not told anybody up to this point. So when you spent 50 years hiding it, it's normal for things to kind of feel like they're falling apart in the beginning, because it's the first time you've ever talked about it with anyone.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
You basically have shut it in that emotional closet, so to speak. And so you're opening the door and letting it loose for the first time in 50 years.
Yeah. And it's sort of bringing it all to the surface again, isn't it, as well? It's and
it can kind of just feel like everything's falling out for the first time, like you've stuffed it all in that jack-in-the-box, and, the air there's more air and more air and more air, and all of a sudden the lid on the jack-in-the-box just blows up.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what it feels like the first, for those of us who, when we first started therapy, it's kind of like everything just kind of blew the lid off of it, so to speak. But, as you continue on, things will calm down and you'll get in an easier routine. But in the beginning, it may feel like, things have gotten a little bit worse. But mostly that's because you spent 30 years trying to deny that it was an issue.
Yes.
And I was real good at that. I had been raised in a Christian home where the only feelings allowed was happiness.
Oh, yeah.
And so I learned to put that good Christian smile, as I called it, on my face at all times. And so to show anybody that I wasn't this happy-go-lucky girl that I showed the world, that was difficult.
Yeah.
And it was hard to go to therapy that first time and admit that everything wasn't as perfect as I showed the world to be.
Yes.
And so it's, again, when you're dealing with PTSD and all these feelings and emotions are, pop up, especially in the beginning of therapy, it feels like everything is a trigger. It feels like every noise is a trigger, every smell is a trigger, even words and phrases that maybe my parents use that somebody else uses in real life, that can also trigger you. So, I mean, it feels like it's everywhere at first.
Yeah. No getting away from it.
But as you begin to unpack those memories of, okay, this is a phrase my mother used when she was hurting me, and my mother is no longer here. You can start to break those connections.
Yeah.
And you can start to understand where those connections are. And that's why having a good trauma therapist who who can deal with those and work with you on them is so important, because they can help you unpack those situations and help you understand that it doesn't mean what you thought it means.
Yeah.
Because again, we carry with us how we thought about that as a child.
Yes, that's true.
So as a child, we make a connection. Okay, I got hurt when I didn't, let's just say, make my bed, and Mom got mad.
Oh.
So as an adult, you're constantly making your bed because you're afraid if you don't, you're going to get hurt.
Yes, yeah. That makes sense.
So, that's just an example, but that's how we carry that as an adult. And having a good trauma therapist can help go in there and help break that thinking that, it's okay if you don't make a bed today. Nobody's going to hurt you if you don't. But you have to be able to unpack where that thought process came from.
Yeah. Was the therapist, when you first had therapy, Nancy, was that a good therapist? The first one?
Yes. The first one I had, bless his heart, he was through the college, and so it was free.
Okay.
And he had just gotten his doctorate, PhD, as a psychologist 4 months before he started seeing me.
Oh, okay, right.
So, he did his best. We really did not. I told him that I'd been sexually abused by my mother, but we really only talked about that maybe once or twice in the year and a half or so that I saw him.
Yeah.
When you graduate, the therapy ends, and mostly we worked on boundaries.
Right.
And which is something that most survivors really struggle with, because with any kind of abuse, whether it's sexual, physical, emotional, verbal, boundaries are crossed daily at growing up.
Mm.
And even if you're being abused by a spouse, you lose personal boundaries because the abuser sets the tone in the house for what is acceptable.
Yeah. Yes,
and
yeah.
So, I had no boundaries when I first got married, and I was seeing Fred, which was the guy's name, the counselor at the college. And so he worked with me mostly with setting appropriate boundaries with my parents.
All right, yeah.
And even though I was young, newly married, when my father called, I literally did think that I had to drop everything I did or was going to do that day and take that call. And if my dad said I needed to go do this or that, I felt like that's what I had to do. I did not feel like I could tell him no.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And, as an abused child, you lose any sense of personal boundaries.
Yes.
And so he worked with me a lot on setting boundaries. And I remember telling him early on, it was a instance where he wanted me to go and spend a holiday with them, and I didn't want to do that because my parents always argued on holidays and bickered back and forth. It was never enjoyable, and I just didn't want to spend my holiday doing that. And he said, well, Nancy, you don't have to go. And I said, no, you don't understand. He's my dad. What his word is like God. And he's like, but Nancy, he's not. And I'm like, you don't understand. He is.
Yeah, yeah.
And, it was a defining moment for me in realizing that, I could have a voice. The world was not going to fall apart if I didn't go spend that holiday with him.
Yeah.
And, he would lay on the guilt. Well, your grandmother may not be alive next year, and you're going to feel horrible if you don't come and spend time with her. And I said, well, Dad, we're going to go spend time with her on Sunday anyway. So, we'll have our time together. It just won't be with you guys.
Yeah.
And slowly but surely, I began to set boundaries, and it didn't happen, instantaneously. It didn't happen overnight, but little by little, I began to say no, and I learned that I could say no, and the world wasn't going to fall apart.
That's it, isn't it? That's the key. Yeah, it's hard to get to that point sometimes.
But it took a lot of unpacking these feelings and thoughts with him. And like I said, it didn't happen overnight. That work continued even when my daughter was small, and I began therapy at the Rape and Sexual Abuse Center, where they have a large center locally where I live, and I would literally have to, because my parents lived, 12-hour drive from where I lived, and we did that on purpose because we knew that we needed to set some distance between us. And so my husband and I moved from where they lived.
Yeah, wisely.
And I would literally write down things that I needed to tell my parents, and I would write it out and keep it near the phone because I knew when they called, I knew how they would react. They reacted that way for 40 years.
Yeah.
And so I would write out what I wanted to say, and I would work this out with my therapist. We would role play it. And she would help me write it out, and I would write out my boundaries. And I literally would read it off when they called.
Good.
But little by little, I found that I could start setting the boundaries without having to do that. But it took practice.
Yeah.
It isn't something that's automatically going to change the first time you do it, and they're not going to react always pleasant either because you're bucking the system.
And they like to throw their tantrums.
They do, and my father would tell me constantly, well, Nancy, you were always the pleasant one. You were always the one who would do what we asked the first time without having to be told. Well, I did, but there was a big cost to that.
Yeah.
Emotionally, there was a cost to never saying no and always doing what they wanted because I literally felt like I wasn't a person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That I didn't exist because I always did what they wanted, but I didn't exist. And as I began to find my voice, I began to figure out who I was as a person.
Mm.
And started getting that sense of self back.
And sorry.
When you deal with abusers, a good part of them are narcissistic.
Yeah.
Meaning that everything is about themselves. They only see the situation based on how it will affect them, not you.
Yeah.
And my father never really did, or my mother never really did understand why I chose to set the boundaries I set. And one thing I learned in all of that is I had to set those boundaries for myself.
Yeah.
Not for how they would respond.
No.
But what was good for me and my own emotional health. And, there were times that I set a boundary as far as not wanting to have my mother come and visit here if my dad came, and just having some just personal boundaries as far as what I felt comfortable with. And they're not always going to understand that, and I had to learn that that's okay.
Yeah.
that it's okay if they don't understand why I'm doing what I'm doing, but for me to feel okay in my life, this is what we need to do.
Yeah, too right. And it's almost like they have the attitude of, how dare you defend yourself from us, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's almost like, how dare you get healthy, because when you get healthy, that means I can't get from you what I want.
Yeah. That's true.
You know, and my dad would say to me, well, if you get this, then I can't get that.
Mm.
Like, I have to do it just so that you can get what you want out of it. But you don't really care that it's hurting me.
Yeah.
All you care about is that I get this from it. And for once, the one thing I really had to learn as I went through therapy is that it is okay to ask for what you need.
Yes.
And when you grow up in a home that is abusive, that inner voice is gone. You don't have it, because it's all about what the parent wants. It's never about what is healthy for the child.
Mm. Yeah.
And so I had to learn that, it's okay to set this boundary, and it's okay to ask for what I want.
Yeah.
And it's okay to tell my parents, no, I don't feel comfortable with that.
Mm.
And my therapist used to tell me, Nancy, you shouldn't even have to explain. You can just say, no, I don't feel comfortable with that, and leave it at that.
Yeah.
You don't have to explain per se, but I always felt like I had to give an answer. I always felt like I was compelled to explain it.
Yeah.
But she would tell me, you don't have to, Nancy. Just saying, I'm not comfortable with that is enough.
Yeah, too right.
And she was right. It should have been enough. But when you're a survivor, you've been raised on everything that we do is for their pleasure or something that they get out of it.
Yeah.
So you constantly have this feeling that you've got to explain yourself because, you're there to serve a purpose somehow for them.
It's horrible, isn't it? It's like not just lack of self-awareness, but how can these people not know? Do they not know what they're like? Do they think that's their normality? Do they know it's evil, but they don't care? I don't know.
That's the whole thing about being narcissistic is they're only seeing all of this for how it affects them.
Yeah.
My father would go on and on and on about what am I going to do with mother, and even from the age of 8 and 9 years old, he would sit down and talk to me about what am I going to do with your mother? Should I send her to a mental institution? And here I'm an 8 or 9 year old kid. I don't know.
No.
Why are you talking to me about this? And I would feel this pressure that I was supposed to know the answer to why mother was acting the way she was acting.
It was almost like
that should have never been discussed with me in the first place, but it made me feel so helpless as a child.
Yeah.
To not know the answer, But it was he never talked to me about what I was going through. It was only about how difficult it was for him.
And it's almost like treating you as the adult, and whereas it's almost like emotionally he was the child looking upon you as the adult.
Exactly. And I was 15 and we just moved for the third time that year. and he and Mother had this huge knockdown, drag-out fight, and he sat down with me and kept asking me, tell me what I should do with her. What should I do? Should I send her away? And I remember just saying, Dad, I don't know. You're the dad.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know? And it's no wonder why at school I was constantly on edge and afraid and timid around other people, and because I was constantly feeling like I had to make decisions that I wasn't prepared to make.
Yeah.
You know, and nobody sat down and asked me how I felt about all of this. It was only about how hard it was for my dad.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it was hard for him, but he should have been talking to another adult or a therapist or a counselor or a pastor or somebody else, but not to his child.
No. Yeah, it's like he was lost on it, wasn't it? Just crying out for help, but you don't cry out for help on your. Yeah, this should be protecting you rather than calling upon you for help. You know.
And that's partly kind of what makes the whole PTSD situation so difficult, because you have always felt like you have to have the answers.
Yeah.
And so when, these things are creeping in your head, and you don't have the answer, it makes you feel very confused, lost, alone, on edge. I mean, that feeling of constantly needing to know the answer and you don't have it is frustrating and scary.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. It's it'll be good to talk further about the the other effects that this has in another broadcast, because it's fascinating, it's sad, it's a mixture of so many things, and it's just deeply intriguing, isn't it, all of it, and the effect it leaves. Sorry.
The National Center for PTSD says about 6 out of every 100 people will experience PTSD at some point in their life.
Oh, really? Okay, that's still too many, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, and they say that for many of them, even with treatment, it can last a year or longer, because, PTSD can be so widespread. It can rear its ugly head from, emotional depression. It can exacerbate it if you have substance abuse or anxiety disorder. All of those can make it even harder to deal with.
Yeah.
And it's the recurring thoughts, the not always knowing what is going to set it off, that can make it so difficult to deal with.
Yeah. It's oh, Nancy, it's always so good to talk to you. You're always so informative, and it's so tragic that these things happen and that there's no response. That's the horrible thing. No apology, no responsibility taken. It's there's so many damaging aspects to this, isn't there? And just, thank
for many people, for a lot of survivors, and for many of us, unless a parent can see the damage they have done, and they really work in therapy with the adult child unless you have that happen. It is the person themselves can heal from PTSD.
Yeah.
However, the interactions with the family may never change into what they really want, because, you know, as children we think, if only we could do this, you know, my mom and dad would act like all the, you know, great families on TV, so to speak.
Oh, yeah.
And so you grow up thinking that if only I changed my behavior, then my mom and dad wouldn't do this to me.
Yeah.
And we would be that close-knit family. And you grow up and you start to realize that even if you change, it doesn't mean they're going to change. And so as adults, part of what we have to do is work through that feeling of, now I can't, and I tell the people I work with now this often, you can't change your parent, your mom or your dad, and they're probably, you know, never going to be the parent that you wish you had, but you can change your reaction to them.
Yes, that's true, yeah.
And so you can't make them listen to you. You can't make them have them ask about you and want to know what's important for you. However, you can change how you respond to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I had to learn with my parents, because my mother ended up moving out here the last 2.5 years of her life, and she helped me with my business some, and we had a fairly okay relationship. But I had to realize that even then, what I really desired and wanted in that close mother and daughter relationship, I was never going to have.
Yeah.
Because she just wasn't capable of giving me that for whatever reason, whether she was damaged too much in her own life.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have all the answers there, but I realized that, okay, I may not get what I really, really, really wished as a child, but I can change how I respond to her and get a different result.
Yeah.
And so, it was never that real close relationship that I really wanted, but it was better than what it had been.
Yeah, that's something. Yeah, that's good.
But it got better because how I was responding her was different than in the early years when I didn't recognize how the PTSD and the memories and the flashbacks were affecting how I responded to her. And I also had learned very clear boundaries, and I set very clear boundaries.
Yeah, that's good.
But again, that came with a lot of therapy and understanding.
Yeah. Yeah.
And being realistic that, okay, she's not really going to be able to give me what I would like to have from her.
Yeah.
But it can be better than what it was.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair enough. Oh, Nancy, sadly
I had to change how I responded to her if I wanted to get it to be a little bit better.
Yeah. Nancy, are you there? Hello? Okay, we seem to have lost Nancy there, but I think that's pretty much summed everything up. And so as usual, we'll have the details of Nancy's website, and I think it's a chat room she's got, so we'll have the details on the homepage. And to the audience, if any of you have gone through anything similar to this, don't suffer in silence. There is help out there, and sometimes it takes a while to for realisation of what's happened. But anyway, it's been a pleasure to have Nancy. Sorry she's something must have happened on the line there. I do apologise for that. But as always, to the audience, thanks for tuning in, and lots of love, and God bless.